The research that I'm going to present, I've started doing at the University of Western Ontario, now called Western University, at the Schulich Interfaculty Program in Public Health. I will be continuing this work at the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health in the SAMI program starting next year, so I'm excited about that and where this is starting to go. And essentially what I'm going to do is present the 3,000-mile view of where the research is rather than start to get into too much local specifics, and you'll see why as I get into that. So for this paper, I've chosen the Anishinaabe word zagatagan as the concept for this paper after discussion with my own language instructor who works in northwestern Ontario. The zagatagan is a tinder bundle used to carry embers from one location to another. It allows fires to be built, food to be prepared, and families to eat. It's a tool among many that's used to keep people alive on the land. He explained that language is very similar to the zagatagan, in that they both keep a community healthy. Fire and language, if unintended, will die. The fire itself, while useful, will not last unless individuals learn how to maintain it. The zagatagan here I'm using as a metaphor for the process and the carrier. In this paper, I consider language as zagatagan, the tool and the process of keeping the fire going. My perspective is that of a public health researcher looking into the role of social inclusion as a protective factor against suicide. In this paper, I explore the relationship between language, retention rates, and suicide in First Nation communities in Ontario. I argue that language as a protective factor in developing youth resilience is best considered as a process into which youth need to be incorporated. Here, youth become zagatagan, carrying the fire and of language with them for the next generation. This metaphor, like any other, can only be maintained in a local enabling discourse. The challenge in doing this is the burden of proof. Given the diversity of First Nations youth within the province, the argument is difficult to make. However, in attempting to do so, social inclusion programs may be developed which may act as a protective factor against depression, substance abuse, and suicide. So the method of this research project combines quantitative and qualitative approaches within a theoretical model derived from Shaw, Mirza, and Mackenzie, and their four-dimensional approach to societology of mental illness. Based on their conceptual work, the overall focus of my research is divided into four areas: individual factors, ecological factors, the interaction between individual and ecological, and time. For the purpose of this paper, I will focus primarily on the interaction of individual and ecological factors and time. Quantitative data was gathered from the Office of the Chief Coroner for Ontario. It includes information on all suicides within the province that are identified as First Nations by the Coroner's Office, for individuals between 1991 and February of 2014. And here the number is 467. The data set includes the date of death, age of death, sex, physical location of the suicide, method, and the community. The data from the Coroner's Office can be divided into 8 administrative reasons. Available census data is then mapped using median age, community population, educational attainment, housing conditions, percent in need of minor or major repair, average income, employment rates, and language retention, which is measured as knowledge of language, and all within individual communities. However, some communities have opted not to participate in the census, creating some holes in the data. Fortunately, the region of greatest concern has the highest rates of census participation, making that data more reliable. For the purpose of this paper, I focused on the geographical distribution of suicides within the province and average language knowledge rates within the 8 regions. Qualitative data originated from unstructured interviews with First Nations youth, defined here as 18 to 30 years old, language instructors and concerned parties within, in and around Western University and at Walpole Island First Nation. The goal of my initial discussion was to formulate a research program that reflected the viewpoint of my focus group. Unstructured discussions were later expanded to include linguists and individuals concerned with language who are working with First Nations communities within the area of greatest concern. The third and ongoing phase of the qualitative data collection consists of structured interviews with youth aged 18 to 30 that self-identified as First Nations to assess the relationship between a number of cultural factors, individual experiences, community histories, and the development of their own sense of self. The interviews have begun in southwestern Ontario, Additionally, I'm currently engaged in Anishinaabe-Moan lessons with an instructor from the area of greatest concern prior to engaging with youth in that area, and I'm doing this on the recommendation of the linguists working in the area. So the results from this so far. Of the initial suicides, 99 were removed because they were from the analysis because they took place in urban settings or correctional facilities, and that's a different project that I'm not going to work on right now. The remaining number, so 365, were divided according to the coroner's administrative regions. Unfortunately, prior to 2004, the coroners tended to list region rather than specific communities, making exact locations impossible to map. Chandler and Lalonde's observation from British Columbia that suicide distribution followed a sawtooth-like pattern is confirmed within Ontario. Two regions account for a significant proportion of the suicides, Region 6 with 74% and Region 7 with 17%. Within the 8 regions, within the 8 regions where data is better from 2004 on, suicides tend to maintain, within the region themselves, suicides tend to maintain the sawtooth-like pattern, with high rates in few communities and low rates or non-existent rates in others. Since 2004, one community in Region 6 accounted for 23.5% of the First Nation suicides in Ontario. Suicide rates are higher in northern fly-in communities than they are in southern, rural, or urban communities. Mapping language retention rates across the 8 regions shows a general trend of lower retention in the southern communities and higher retention rates in the northern communities. Regional rates range from an approximate 54% in the northern regions to a low of 4.6% in the southern regions. Similar to suicides rate within regions, language retention varies on a community-by-community basis. Rates within Region 6 range from a low of 30.8% to a high of 99.2% across 43 communities. Because Region 6, identified as the region of greatest concern, represents a large geographical area, essentially James Bay over to the Manitoba border, I examined this area further to determine whether or not population size is driving up the suicide numbers. Right, there's just a problem of larger population relative to low populations in the south. Again, the sawtooth pattern becomes a factor here. 3 communities within this region accounted for 30% of all non-urban suicides in Ontario between 2004 and 2013. Additionally, many communities have few or no suicides in this region. An additional 2 communities in Region 7 bring the total for 5 communities up to 40% for Ontario's First Nations suicides during that era. From this, I conclude the size of the population within Region 6 is not the primary factor for the elevated numbers. I do actually think, though, that looking into a cohort effect in the area might be useful. So turning my focus to social inclusion and its antithesis, social exclusion, as the conditions for individuals to be accepted or to participate fully within our families, our communities, and our society, social inclusion is a determinant of health that allows us to rank individuals based on their interaction with or distancing from society. And it's a concept that has a long history with suicide research. Public health concerns associated with social exclusion include antisocial behavior, increased substance abuse, violent behavior, decreased income, and increased crime rates. Work by Yarov et al. From 2011 confirmed a positive relationship between social exclusion and suicide rates among males in 26 European countries. Put simply, to be included allows individuals to have access to the benefits of being in a social support network. To be isolated or excluded puts individuals at risk. So social inclusion is essentially about relationships, and we all know what relationships mean. Within the 4-dimensional concept model, I argue that social inclusion is best understood as the interaction of individual and ecological factors. Hallett, Chandler, and Lalonde, 2007, made this connection by focusing on language retention rates and protective factors against suicide in British Columbia. What is important from their work is how they connect protective factors with threats to personal and community persistence and identity. Their position maintains that it is the process of language renewal that matters. Specifically, they reference rehabilitating language. However, their findings are in opposition to the results that I presented for Ontario. They found that communities with the majority of members having a conversational level of the knowledge of the language had low to absent suicide rates. Based on these findings, I believe it is evident that language in and of itself may not be the protective factor, and I feel really uncomfortable saying that because that's just seems wrong. This necessitates the consideration of other factors that language can interact with to gain the protective aspect. With this in mind, I turn to Kiermaier, who identified the role of autonomy and local control within the model developed by Chandler and Lalonde, and believed that it is in localness that inclusion is built, that the social inclusion is built. Consider the fourth dimension of time from the Shaw model, and how it can be applied to examine autonomy and the role of local context in determining effectiveness of factors in preventing and promoting negative health outcomes. The following quote comes from a First Nations adult in a community in northwestern Ontario. And I've removed the name of the community, so when I blank there, just ignore me. If you look at these communities, not so long ago, they were thriving communities. They were thriving communities in that they had a stable culture in a stable environment. That is not the case now. I do believe that this is the roots of the problem. Everywhere you look, on TV, on the internet, everywhere across this vast country, there's nothing is valued of the Ojibwe or any other Aboriginal people except maybe some fancy artwork. The best we get is an occasional apology or something from the RCMP or government from things that they may have done, as they put it. The problem, community name removed, are worse than other surrounding communities, but they are in some situations that other surrounding communities are no longer in, and they are going through these situations in circumstances and an environment in which the other communities did not. In accounting for the social role in the determinants of mental health, the local context must be considered because not all communities experience the same social, economic, and political pressures at the same time. The result has been an unequal distribution of social determinants. Hallett, Chandler, and Lalonde are basing their assessment on communities that are in different social contexts to those facing suicide problems than Northern Ontario. These findings are better matched with the context described by First Nations youth in southwestern Ontario, where communities have lower language retention, but language is being used by youth as a way of defining their own personalities, or their own identities as Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. I return to the metaphor of the Zagatagan. The tool is not the fire, that from which the fire comes. A situation described by McCarty et al. In the southwestern United States may be useful in understanding this concept. While working with Navajo communities during the Native Language Shift and Retention Study, the authors compared two language discourses, language as identity, and language endangerment. So we are who we are because we speak the language, and if the language is disappearing, then we're disappearing, versus language pride and language shame. And I'm going to focus on the latter two. They found that those who represented the group with language pride saw their Navajo languages as a means of making them a better person. Many discussed becoming physicians and being able to work better with their communities because they knew their language. The opposite of this pair was the language shame discourse. Here, English was seen as a synonym for educated and connected discursively to progress and a better future. The youth tended to hide the fact that they spoke the language at home, some going as far as deny that their parents spoke the language as well. Considering this in conversations with language speakers, learners, and other parties, I consider the possession of language in two Ontario contexts. One, where almost everyone speaks their language, and one where few have knowledge of their traditional language. In the first context, language as shame seems to be present. Qualitative data suggests that language acts as a perceived barrier, and perceived is really the key there, perceived barrier, keeping youth from accessing the benefits of the market economy and signifying disconnect. In the other, language as pride is present. Here, language acts as a powerful symbol of cultural autonomy. Perhaps a blending of language as identity is also taking place. And I'm going to step out of this for a second. What's interesting, though, is you can't get youth in southwestern Ontario to actually sign up for language courses. They all agree it's interesting and it's important, but the retention rate of keeping them in the classroom is very low. There's actually a conference on that at U of T earlier this year to try and figure out how to get them to actually stay in the class. So they they want to, but they don't actually want to take the class. So responding to the problem of youth language retention and its relationship to suicide, one First Nations adult responded by saying, either they will entirely give up their language and what remains of their culture, and then the suicides will diminish, or they will embrace their language and what remains of their culture, and the suicide rates will diminish. The second one is the harder path, and the first one is easier. So I suspect, as much as I love this community and the people in it, that the first one is what they will do, because that is what the young people think. They embrace everything that isn't them. The interaction of the social determinants that contribute to the conditions that promote youth resilience are far more complex than a few isolated factors. I would not expect youth suicide to disappear with the language. However, the evidence for the importance of social inclusion is well established. I argue that there's need for further research into the means of building social inclusion within First Nations youth communities, which a lot of people here have presented and are doing. Quantitative data clearly demonstrates an uneven distribution of suicides within the province. The data has also demonstrated that conditions across the region of greatest concern are similar across communities, with both high and low suicide rates warranting future research into the social conditions that contribute to the suicides. So housing conditions, employment, income, things like that. They're standard across a lot of the communities, and the suicide rates are not. Contrary to the British Columbia data, Ontario First Nations do not seem to be protected by language retention. However, this statement should not be considered as a reason to give up on the language. I return to the metaphor of the Zagatagan, where it is the process that is key to building the fire. Additional qualitative work needs to be completed in this area to assess the status of language within different discursive contexts. Discursive contexts, in part, help explain why protective factors in Ontario seem to differ from those around BC, because the historical, economic, social, cultural contexts differ, and the meaning of the language to the youth also differs. So, thank you. I'm done.